Leaders of the 46 member countries of the Council of Europe are meeting in Iceland for their first summit in 18 years. The organisation was set up after the Second World War to uphold human rights across the continent. As it meets for just the fourth time, it's offering support for Ukraine while holding Russia accountable for the damage done by its invasion. Following the meeting, the UK and the Netherlands pledged to build an international coalition to provide fighter jet support for Ukraine.
The anthem of Europe rang out in Reykjavik as leaders from the Council of Europe met for the first time in almost 2 decades, spurred on by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The summit is only the fourth of its kind since the inception of the post-war body 74 years ago. As the leaders gave their opening remarks, it was clear what was top of the meeting's agenda.
Ukraine is fighting for the values we believe in and we hold so dearly. And I'm so grateful that we are united in protecting peace and promoting democracy, because this is the very reason why the Council of Europe was created.
The Ukrainian president delivered a virtual address, making his now familiar plea for planes.
Thank you so much. We also need modern fighter jets, without which no air defense system will be perfect. And I'm sure we will get there. 100% should be our benchmark. We must leave 0% to the aggressor.
On that front, a signal of progress from the sidelines, as UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and his Dutch counterpart Mark Rutte agreed to build an international coalition to provide Kyiv with fighter jet support, procuring F-16 jets, and training pilots. Western countries have so far been wary of taking such steps over fears the war could escalate.
Well, for more on this, I'm now joined by our correspondent Lucia Scholten in Reykjavik. Lucia, the international coalition to provide fighter jet support for Ukraine that the prime ministers of the UK and Netherlands want to build. What more do you know about that?
Yeah, it is still early days. We heard yesterday after the meeting of the Prime Minister Rutte and also Rishi Sunak that they would work in building an international coalition to provide Ukraine with air combat capabilities. And this would also include training, but also the procurement of F-16 fighter jets. At this stage, I would expect them to reach out to other heads of states to bring this topic on the agenda. But what this international coalition will look like, this will still remain to be seen. You could, of course, think a bit of the tank coalition, where it also started with a coalition and then in the end it did lead to tanks being delivered to Ukraine. But other leaders of heads of states have been reluctant in the past.
Now, is there any support from other European leaders for this coalition?
Yeah, I already alluded to that. So there has indeed been reluctance of European leaders, but also of NATO allies, to deliver F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. President Zelenskyy has been in Europe last week. In this, Emmanuel Macron has said that France is willing to train Ukraine soldiers on Western fighter jets, but there has been no promise to actually deliver fighter jets. So this will maybe be a momentum now that will be started by this new coalition, but it is still very early days.
Now, today the heads of states will also sign off a register of damages for the aggression in Russia, for the aggression in Ukraine, sorry. What does this mean?
Yeah, there is supposed to be a new register built in which people, Ukrainians, can bring forward their damages that will be registered, damages also in losses of life, but also material damages. And this register should serve for future trials because of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, and this will be signed off here today. Council of Europe members can join, but also other countries can join, and for example the US is said to be joining, so this is what will come out of this meeting here in Reykjavik.
Thank you very much, DW correspondent Lucia Schulten in Reykjavik. Let's now bring in Mike Martin, War Studies Senior Fellow at King's College in London. Now, what difference would these fighter jets make in Ukraine?
One of the most fascinating things about this war is that the Russians completely failed to gain air superiority, which is a prerequisite for fighting a modern campaign. And so the airspace is contested. So what the addition of more air power, because Ukraine does have some fighter jets, has helicopters and drones, but this is about more air power. It will enable the Ukrainians to strike with greater frequency targets that are well behind the front lines.
Now, Rutte and Sunak are talking specifically about F-16 fighter jets. Why that? What kind of jets are these?
Well, the F-16 is actually 50 years old, but it's a very, very versatile fighter. It was originally designed for air-to-air missions, but now has evolved into predominantly ground attack, as we just discussed. But the reason that the F-16 has been chosen is not necessarily because it has particular capabilities. Many, many fighter jets have those capabilities, but it's because it's the most common fighter jet in the world. So over the last 50 years, over 4,600 have been built. It's in service with 25 countries around the world. So in choosing the F-16, Sunak and Rutte are creating a stable pipeline of equipment, training and jets for Ukraine that can last for the long term.
Now, why have Western states been hesitant so far about sending fighter jets?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing is about complexity. So it's not just the fighter jet, but it's also the training, the ground support staff, the spare parts, the control of the air traffic space. So it's quite complicated to get a fighter jet up and enable it to target things in a battlefield. But secondly as well, in order to do that targeting that we've discussed of, let's say, a Russian logistics dump 300 miles, 500 kilometers behind the Russian front lines, it requires very precise intelligence. And that's only going to come from the Western countries. And so these strikes that the F-16s will eventually be doing will be guided by Western intelligence. And so that further drags Western nations, NATO partners, into the war in Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Mike Martin there from King's College, London.
Thank you.
And I also talked about this with our correspondent Matthias Berlinger in Kyiv about the reactions to this announcement in Ukraine.
It's no secret that Ukraine has been pushing for this hard for the last few months. It's something that is seen really critical as a critical component of Ukraine's strategy here. Ukraine has started into this war with a very weak air force, an air force that had not been very well maintained. Many planes that it had inherited from the Soviet Union had been already decommissioned, and Russia was seen as having really the upper hand in the air. Ukraine's air force has done very well, but it has lost also a number of planes and pilots, and for further offensive operations and also for air defense, it's seen as critical. That's why Ukraine has been pushing so hard, and of course, accordingly, people here are very content. Not only politicians, military people, but also society has paid a lot of attention to this issue.
What's the current situation now? We heard last time we spoke, we talked about Bakhmut.
We are hearing that Ukrainian forces are advancing on the flanks of Bakhmut. That means north and south of the town itself. Inside the town, fighting is still going on. It's still pretty fierce, and Russia seems to have advanced there by a few blocks as well. So it's two movements at the same time. These news, of course, about Ukraine advancing on the flanks again is watched closely here in Ukraine, and Russian Telegram channels, pro-war channels in Russia seem to be very worried about this. So there's, of course, now a huge debate in Ukraine of whether it would eventually be possible to encircle the city. However, this is not the scale that we are talking about. We are talking about a few kilometers, which are remarkable, but which are not yet a change of the situation in the field.
Matthias Berlinger there reporting from Kyiv. Thank you very much, Matthias.